Hello, my name is Patrick Stapleton, and this is my technical presentation on the analysis of the oil industry in the United Arab Emirates. I think it's worth noting that the UAE was founded in 1971 after oil was discovered in 1958. And when we talk about oil in the Middle East, I think this is the picture our mind pulls up. Lots of deserts, not very developed. But in all reality, the UAE is looking like this in 2020. It's very Western, very modern, very wealthy, and very based in oil. Into what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the strengths, opportunities, weaknesses, and threats. And I think I want to start with the positives because there's a lot of them with this country that I'm very excited to talk about. To start with strengths, the UAE, like I said, is very modern and relatively Western, and that leads to a lot of doors opening with developed nations that you will see more than once in this presentation. For example, here, the Japanese crude oil imports by origin, the UAE is responsible for 770,000 of the 3.04 million barrels per day that Japan imports. And this is a small sliver of their exports as the UAE actually exports around 2.5 million barrels a day of petroleum products. Internally speaking, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company is one of few industries that is really succeeding in 2020 as the global economy is really being put down. As you can see on the graph, the COVID-19 pandemic obviously led to a very large dip in stock price. But since that pandemic, they're actually up 32.6% on the Abu Dhabi National Exchange, which is a really good indicator of how the company is doing as a whole and how they're handling the pandemic. And I think that that's a really important strength is that they can handle this adversity. Opportunities. So the opportunities in the UAE are really exciting, especially when we talk about shale. So as we know, shale is still being discovered, still being perfected. And as you can see here, these green spots on the map are shale oil fields. And it's approximated that there are 396 billion barrels in these tight shale reserves in the UAE. And I just think that as shale becomes more producible and as we get away from this like 6 to 10% production range, I think the UAE is going to be the site of a lot of important, interesting research and a lot of opportunity in the future as we get into these shale reserves. Like I said, you're going to see the open doors with Western nations more than once. Total SE is a French refinery company. And this METIS project is really, really exciting. So they started in 2017 in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, where they were taking drones to drop seismic sensors into the jungle to find these onshore reserves. What's so exciting is they said in November 2020, but it's been postponed. They are going to be dropping these seismic drones into the dunes of the UAE to find these shale reserves. So as you can see, like I said before, the UAE is really important because they have these large reserves and they're also open to working with Western companies, which we don't see in a lot of Middle Eastern societies. And I just think that as we move forward, this cooperation between the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company and Western countries that have just better technological advancements to work with, that relationship is going to grow and we're going to see a lot of success from the UAE. Now, moving into weaknesses, the picture you see here is a ship from a terrorist attack that was taken against more than one country. It was taken against a Norwegian, a United Arab Emirate, and 2 Saudi Arabian ships. And this is just an unfortunate symptom of the region that the UAE is currently in, where, as we know, the politics of the Middle East are complicated and more often than not turn to violent. And this is generally weakness just because while companies that are operating in like North America or South America and pulling out oil don't have to face this violence as much, in the Middle East, it's kind of a constant threat. But luckily, the UAE is further removed from that than, say, Iran or Saudi Arabia. And this is one of very few attacks that they've had in recent times. The ownership of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company is very important to think about. So they are a state-owned company. Like the United Arab Emirates government owns the company, which is good in some ways. But at the end of the day, when a company is run by tax dollars, I think that success is kind of necessary. And when that doesn't happen, it's a problem. For example, in October of 2020, the government invested $2.1 billion in the company in pipelines. The ownership of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company is a very important factor that has to be discussed. It is the only oil company in the UAE because it is state owned. It's owned by the United Arab Emirates government. And that's important because when tax dollars are used in this company, success is kind of necessary. Otherwise, it's a huge loss for the country as a whole. And for example, $2.1 billion were invested in pipelines in October of 2020. And on the off chance that something does happen to those pipelines, it's a loss for the people, the company, the government, and everybody involved. And I just think that that's something that in general has to be considered a weakness just because it's more of a loss than a private company. Threats, unfortunately, 2020 has been a rough year for the economy. And as you can see, sorry about that. As you can see, the COVID cases in the UAE are on a steep rise. They've risen over 136,000 cases since the first lockdown. That's important because the GDP has unfortunately dropped 8% in 2020, which is really, really scary. That's a pretty large percentage. And it's a threat for the whole world, but unfortunately, the UAE is taking this head on. And in the future, who knows what's going to happen, but this has to be considered a major threat. Diversification. The UAE is making a smart choice on a national standpoint where they're trying to diversify their economy away from oil and gas. As you can see, it makes up over a third of their production. But in terms of the petroleum industry specifically, this has to be considered a threat just because it means less funding, less produce, and at the end of the day, less profit. So that's a pretty major threat. And then globally speaking, so as you can see, the UAE makes up 8.2% of the crude oil reserves in OPEC's reserves. But on Friday of November 13th, the UAE released a statement that they were considering dropping out of OPEC, which on a national standpoint, again, could be good. But at the end of the day, when you're looking at the petroleum industry specifically, it has to be considered a threat because now, if they do drop out, their control over the oil price from their specific country drops a lot because they're going to be competing with OPEC. So they're just going to have, in general, less control over their own prices. And I think that volatility that they're about to introduce could lead to a lot of problems. So again, good for the country, but not for the industry. Has to be considered a threat. I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of opportunities when we see shale oil being produced a lot better and when we see the threats start to subside, like when COVID gets better. But as we know, only time will tell. And thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you consider what I've spoken about. Thank you.